Assalamu alaikum everyone, I'm Azhar Imran and back with my third and final part of the video lecture series on CSS current affair. In this part of the video, we are going to talk about perhaps the most important and most challenging question and task that students have in mind is that if the syllabus of the CSS current affair is so diversified, so dynamic, so developing and changing with development and evolution taking place in the world, politics and international affairs, how then we can prepare 100% syllabus, hoping to attempt all of the questions in the exam scoring maximum. Here is the solution for that. So let me briefly talk about that lot of the questions that I receive from my students and from the students who are not directly studying from me, but they are contacting me through social media and other platforms, that what books I recommend them to study for, what books I recommend them to study for CSS current affairs. Most of those students have unfortunately this common misperception that they go for very generic books. Most of those books which are written by different academies, published by different publishing house, frankly speaking, those are not books. They are different notes compiled under the title of the books. So don't go for them. If I could give you my own opinion, they are extremely poorly written when it comes to quality. Their quality is very poor. Their data is outdated, and most of the books have huge grammatical mistakes. So they would create a problem for your grammatical understanding. They would provide you very poor quality reading material, and of course the data they have is very outdated. And of course some of those books have comprised of different notes of different formats, students who qualified CSS, so certainly that is very outdated in the context. So if we look at the particularly 2019 and 2020 CSS papers, generally all of the CSS papers, particularly the current affairs paper, the examiner has changed the orthodox method and pattern of setting up the exam. So you need to prepare according to just new dimensions and approaches the examiner has been asking the student in the papers, particularly in CSS current affair 2020 paper. So I'm going to talk about that you are not going to rely and don't depend on any of the so-called books under the umbrella of the books published by different academies and the publishing house. So here I am going to give you how to start for the CSS current affair preparation. One book that I think is perhaps most important, very fascinating, it would help you not only to cover many of the CSS essay topics of current affairs, but also almost 60 to 70% of the CSS current affairs syllabus as well, is written by one of the famous historians and professor at the University of Tel Aviv in Israel, Yuval Noah Harari, 21 Lessons for 21st Century. Yuval Noah Harari is a leading scholar and analyst, and of course a leading professor. He's written a very many other best-selling books as well. But in this book, he discusses few challenges the world is facing in the 21st century, and perhaps those challenges are very relevant to the syllabus of the CSS current affair. So at least 60 to 70% CSS current affair syllabus would be covered from that book. So go for that. It will help you to have very productive vocabulary, improve your grammatical understanding, and of course have more conceptual critical understanding of international issues written by one of the greatest scholars of our time. Now moving to the second part, that how to cover those parts which are specifically relevant to the Pakistan's part of the current affairs syllabus, like Pakistan's foreign policy and Pakistan's domestic issues. Two books are extremely relevant for that. One, Pakistan: A Concise History, written by M.R. Kazmi. Go for that book. That book will provide you an outstanding, holistic, brief review of Pakistan's history that would also cover the Pakistan affair, but also many of the foreign affairs policy issues of Pakistan and many of those issues that are part of the CSS current affairs syllabus. Then of course, if you still think that you have not completed your preparation for CSS current affairs, you can go on to rely on another book which is written by one of the finest diplomats that Pakistan has produced, and former Secretary of State, former Pakistan's Foreign Secretary Shamshad Ahmad Khan, Pakistan and World Affairs. So these three books are your primary text and reading and study material for CSS current affairs. I'm sure that these books would provide you and would equip you with that minimum reading material, knowledge and intellectual abilities and critical thinking that you need to employ to go into your CSS current affair paper to score at least 60 plus. Now the fundamental question is that CSS current affairs syllabus is not static, is ever changing, it is growing. Because if we look at the past papers, CSS current affairs, for example, when I started teaching in my January 2019 to the CSS student, the topic I taught in January 2019 was very much different, the topic I taught in 2019 December. Within 7-8 months, there huge changes take place. Then the question is how we can overcome such changes with respect to the current affair. For example, if you have prepared Middle East in January 2020, it's quite possible by December 2020 the Middle East has a totally different scenario. For example, if you have covered US-China in Indo-Pacific in 2020 January, it may have a different outlook in December 2020. For that, you have to equip yourself with the changing knowledge through media and newspaper. So in third part, your reading and material and reading resource should be your daily engagement with leading local and international newspapers. For example, Dawn is by many CSS toppers and of course veteran professors and scholars called Dawn as a Bible of CSS. So I would go with that you should start your day or end your day with a mandatory reading of the Dawn newspaper, particularly its 3 sections. Its international affairs or international news section, its op-ed section, the editorial page, the opinion editorial page, and the editorial page, as well as its weekly special edition on economy comprising the local economic issues and the global economic issues. That should be. Then of course, if you want to further equip yourself to have a more holistic and critical understanding of the changes that are taking place in international affairs with respect to current affairs, look at 3 fundamental international newspapers that I would recommend you to build your knowledge and understanding of international issues. Go for Al Jazeera, very important web newspaper. It's fascinating, covering Middle Eastern politics and many of the international issues and perspectives, different analysis presenting a non-Western perspective and non-Western worldview of international issues. Of course, the second I would recommend to go for, Guardian. Guardian is an extremely important newspaper when it comes to current affair, particularly its opinion section. Some of the writers of the Guardian opinion sections are leading professors, academics, and scholars, which will not only help you to build your vocabulary, but also will help you that how you develop your writing and analysis on issues of international affairs with respect to particular perspective. So that's very important. Of course, these 2 are very important and compulsory recommendation for reading to build your current affair knowledge. But if you still find the time and you have the interest and zeal for reading, you can go for some of the other leading international newspapers like New York Times and BBC, looking at the BBC websites. But keep in mind, sometimes these newspapers have a very political and biased and compromised opinion, looking from more geopolitical perspective of the West and the American interest. So that's why you have to have comparative reading of international newspapers so that you can have more nuanced understanding and analysis of these topics. So for this to have more nuance and critical understanding of these international issues, I'm going to recommend you some of the international writers that you can study and read and can watch their lectures on YouTube as well to have more critical perspective understanding of international affairs. So for example, Hamid Dabashi is a leading professor and scholar at Columbia University, New York. He writes analysis in Al Jazeera on Middle Eastern and global power politics. You can rely to him. Similarly, Rashid Khaldi, another professor of Middle Eastern Studies at Columbia University. So reading him, you would have more understanding of the Middle East as well. Similarly, one of my favorite writers and professor is Galbert Ashker. He's a professor at University of London School of African and Oriental Studies, a very good writer on Middle East and international relations. Look at his writings. And similarly, to understand American foreign policy and American geopolitics, you look at some of the leading American professors who have delivered lectures through TED Talks. They are all available on YouTube, and the good thing about these TED Talks is they are very short 20-25 minutes lectures explaining all the dimension and contemporary issues with respect to a particular challenge. So starting from those books, going on to Dawn newspaper, then some of the international newspaper, then some of the international writers that I have just named out, and then of course going to TED Talks available on YouTube. Just listen to those lectures and you would have a very critical, comprehensive, analytical understanding of current affair, and I can guarantee you that with that understanding you can not only score good in current affair with 60+ marks, but also you will be having confidence with enough knowledge to write a good essay as well if there is an essay on current affair CSS. Thank you very much. You can contact me on social media and through Kips forum if you have any question and queries. Take care.